Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick too. Today I'm going to be showing you guys the best Whirlwind Barbarian build. This build is probably one of the fastest builds in the entire game. If you're looking to just absolutely nuke everything while spinning to win your way to victory, annihilating everything in your path while being one of the fastest builds of all time to do it, this is the perfect build for you. As you can see, the damage is unbelievably insane. You have a crazy amount of survivability, but it's also just one of the fastest and most efficient builds to use for farming, leveling up, and just grinding the game. All you have to do is literally just spin through enemies and they fall over. This is probably one of the most classic ways to play a Barbarian, and thankfully in Diablo 4 it is still unbelievably strong, as you can see in the gameplay, and it is very comparable in power to the Hammer of the Ancients Barbarian. And if Hammer of the Ancients ever gets nerfed, boom, you have a perfect build to use that you don't really have to worry about getting nerfed. You guys can tell how good it is by the gameplay. I don't have to keep raving on about it, so let's just get into the build. Real quickly, I want to mention that I'm doing a subathon today, right now, on Saturday, June 24th. Every single sub is going to extend the duration of the stream. Probably going to stream for 24 hours. And for the whole 24 hours, I'm going to be doing carries, helping you guys do nightmare dungeons to get your glyphs leveled up, helping you guys do capstone dungeons on your alt characters, level up your alt characters by doing XP and loot farms, etc. Going to be helping a ton of you guys out. I'd love to see more of you guys around. Feel free to stop by, support by dropping a Twitch Prime or something, or feel free to just, hang out and get carried. Also forgot to mention the entirety of the build will be posted on my website, so make sure to check that out if you want to see where the skill points are, the priority list of the legendaries, all of the full list of the legendaries, the priority list of the stats on your gear, etc. Cringe YouTuber stuff aside, let's get into the build. So, full transparency, this is my friend's build. I helped him theory craft it. I helped him set up the gear and stuff, but it is his gameplay. It is on his character. I do not have 3 level 100s at this point. Getting close though. But yeah, this is my friend's build, so it is all his gameplay. So we are using his recording. Anyways, when it comes to our skills here, obviously it's a Whirlwind build, so we're going to use Whirlwind. But our basic skill is going to be Lunging Strike. This is very important, not only for the mobility, but it also, anytime you crit with it, it's going to give us Berserking, which we crit a lot with this build. And we also just generate a ton of Fury with Lunging Strike. It also has a pretty high lucky hit chance, which is good for a few different reasons. But we mainly use this for the mobility and the good Fury generation. And then, of course, we have Whirlwind. Whirlwind has a lot of really good stuff going for it here. The base damage is pretty low, but we can compensate with that with a lot of different things. But the best thing about Whirlwind is that it just hits everything in a circle around you, and it does damage multiple times a second. So you just can clear out maps incredibly quickly. It also has a pretty high lucky hit chance, which we take advantage of in multiple different ways. Whirlwind also has some pretty interesting snapshotting mechanics, where if you have a lot of buffs and a lot of damage stuff, before you press it, it's going to last for the entire duration of Whirlwind, which means you can take advantage of a lot of stuff to just greatly increase the damage of your Whirlwind. So obviously Whirlwind build, so we're going to use Whirlwind. For the rest of our skills, we're going to be using the quadruple shout combo. The reason for this is that the 3 shouts are unbelievably powerful. They work synergistically with each other. While you have them up, you get Fury generation, so the build just won't work without them. Challenging shout is amazing damage reduction. You get extra HP, you get extra Fury. Rallying Cry literally gives you Fury generation, so the build just really wouldn't work without Rallying Cry because it's so much Fury gen. You get crazy movement speed. It works for your allies, which is great. You get unstoppable, so you don't get CC'd all the time. And we have the last one, which just gives us extra damage, but it also works for our teammates, which is great. And we get the Berserking, so that's great. But you pretty much need all 3 of the shouts because they work very synergistically with each other to reduce cooldowns, but also while you have all 3 of them up, you get more Fury generation. So the shouts are pretty much mandatory, unfortunately, just because of how good they are. And for our last skill, we're using Wrath of the Berserker here. The reason for this is just because it gives you more damage. It really helps with bossing. So you just get a lot of extra damage when you need it against really big elite packs and bosses. And if you ever run into a time when your shouts aren't active, you can pop this to help mitigate that. If you don't want to use the ultimate, feel free to use like Leap or something like that. It's really not all that big of a deal. If you don't really want to use the ultimate, feel free to just swap this to like Leap for mobility. But honestly, you don't have that many other options that are really all that good. Now let's get into the skill tree. So again, for your basic skill, you want Lunging Strike, and you want to go into the crit for the Berserking for the extra Berserking uptime. And then obviously you have Whirlwind with Violent Whirlwind, just give us a whole bunch of additional damage. And we pretty much have 30% extra damage all the time while we're Whirlwinding. Then we go 3 points into Pressure Point. Pressure Point gives us a lot of extra vulnerable application, especially against bosses, because it's pretty much our only source of vulnerable. It is lucky hit based, but fortunately for us, Whirlwind has a pretty good lucky hit chance, and because we're constantly spinning, constantly dishing out that damage, you do have a decent likelihood to proc vulnerable. Sometimes you'll get unlucky and sometimes you won't proc it, but generally speaking, you'll have pretty good vulnerable uptime just with Pressure Point, at least on bosses, but otherwise your vulnerable comes from a glyph, which is pretty much 100% uptime when just doing normal stuff. When it comes to our shouts, we go Tactical Rallying Cry for the extra resource generation. That is pretty much mandatory for us. And then we go into Challenging Shout. We get a whole bunch of points for this with our gear, and this gives us 54% damage reduction. And we also get the extra Fury while it's active, which is incredibly powerful there. Love that. And then we have Warcry for just some extra damage. You could go Power Warcry for the extra 10%, or you could go into, what is it called here? Yeah, Mighty Warcry for the extra Fortify, if you feel like you want a tiny bit more survivability, but your Fortify uptime should be pretty fine with one of our Legendaries. Then we get 3 points into Booming Voice. Since we have 3 shouts, getting the extra duration on all of them is incredibly good. And then we have Guttural Yell, so that anytime we use our shout skills, enemies deal 12% less damage. So that's 12% less damage enemies deal pretty much all the time, so that's incredibly strong. And then we have 2 points into a Rallying Cry here, or sorry, Raid Leader. Rallying Cry, it's like I'm playing World of Warcraft. Raid Leader, our shouts are going to heal us for 2% of our HP per second. You could take 1 point out of the other thing and put it in here if you want more healing, but 2% is more than enough because it works for all of our shout skills. So we get 6% HP per second, which is crazy good. Then we go 1 point to Aggressive Resistance, so we can drop 3 into Prolific Fury. So we get the 18% Fury gen, which is pretty much mandatory because Whirlwind is so expensive. We get 3 points into Pit Fighter for extra damage, and then 3 into No Mercy. We actually have this through our Amulet tier, which gives us 18% increased crit chance against slowed or stunned. We're actually stunning enemies a decent bit, but we are instantaneously slowing all enemies because we are using Hamstring. Hamstring is going to apply a slow anytime that we bleed enemies. The way that we are bleeding enemies, you may ask, is by using the sword technique. We use a sword technique, and we don't actually have to use swords on our Whirlwind. We actually use maces on our Whirlwind, which we'll talk more about in a second. We basically just get free crowd control, which works for a ton of different things, but mainly it works for No Mercy, which is 18% crit chance, which is a crazy amount of extra damage for us. That's just unbelievable. Wish I had that on my rogue. And then we have 1 point into Thick Skin, so that we can get 3 into Counter Offensive. So we just deal 12% extra damage almost all the time because we get so much Fortify generation with this build, which ends up being really good for us. Then we just put a few points into Wrath of the Berserker. Like I said, this is just extra damage. If you don't want to use this, feel free, but you just get a crazy amount of extra damage, Fury generation, movement speed, and Unstoppable with this. So it really just works well with the build, even though it does have quite a long cooldown. If you don't want to use this, feel free to just do Leap for more movement speed or something. And then we have Unbridled Rage, so that our core skill just does extra damage. It's going to cost way more Fury. If you're realizing that you simply just don't have enough Fury for the build to work, which is going to be really hard because you need certain Legendaries for the build to function, but if it's not really working for you, feel free to take this off and just go for the Berserking one, because that will make the build work a little bit better. But ultimately, you want to work up towards the goal of using Unbridled Rage so that you have extra damage, because it's just a crazy amount of damage, right? Then we go into 3 points into Heavy Handed for 15% crit damage. You could alternatively get this on the Amulet as well, but No Mercy is better, so that is just a lot of damage for us. Then we have 3 points into Wallop, so our bludgeoning weapons deal 15% increased damage if the enemy is stunned or vulnerable. Enemies are permanently vulnerable, and we are using a bludgeoning weapon because we are using Mace with our Whirlwind, and this is one of the main reasons for the Mace Whirlwind. Another reason for Mace Whirlwind, outside of Wallop, is Concussion. Concussion is lucky hit, so it does not happen all that often, but remember, Whirlwind has a pretty decent bit of lucky hit chance, so every once in a while you will stun an enemy, and that's pretty nice. And because we're using a two-handed bludgeoning, it's a 45% chance to stun enemies for 3 seconds, and stun is the most powerful crowd control in the game. So that's one of the main reasons that we are actually using maces, but also if we use mace, we have another lucky hit effect, where we have a 10% chance to just gain extra Fury, and we double this, so we get 4 Fury every time that we get a lucky hit chance while we are berserking, which is basically all the time. So we're constantly spinning and getting a bunch of Fury back, which really helps for just maintaining the extremely expensive cost of Whirlwind. Then we also gain 15% increased crit damage to stunned and vulnerable enemies while we're berserking. So we just get a lot of damage through this, and then we just slap on the two-handed sword expertise. We're not using axes. Axes is a pretty good amount of extra damage, I will admit, especially the crit chance there. But having the ability to stun is really good. But if you don't want to build into all this lucky hit stuff, you just want more consistent damage, then using axes is good, and then taking the points out of Wallop and stuff is perfectly fine. But it just doesn't have as much of a top-end potential. If you want to know how to swap your weapon, just being your Whirlwind, to a bludgeoning weapon, basically all you have to do is just open your skill screen and then you just press a few buttons. Like on PC, it's just you press your mouse wheel and then you will swap it to the bludgeoning weapon, which is what you want. Another reason that stun is so good is that we actually use the aspect of retribution for 38% increased damage to stunned enemies. I will admit this is not active all that often, But against certain elites that are very tanky, if you happen to stun them instantly, you'll pretty much just get nuked because this is a lot of extra damage, and you have a lot of extra slots with this build. But if you wanted to play axe instead of mace, and you didn't want to use all this extra lucky hit based stuff, you could definitely take this off. You could even consider putting this on a two-hander if you just wanted to do a crazy amount of damage, but personally, I think it's better to just have limitless rage for a way more consistent application of damage. Each point of fury you gen is just going to increase your core skill damage. You're constantly generating fury above max by just popping your shouts and just pressing lunging strike here and there with all your resource gen. So that's just a ton of extra damage for us. And then our next mandatory one that we want on our two-hander is going to be the dire whirlwind aspect for 48% increased crit chance, pretty much for our entire whirlwind duration. It's for each second, so you only need a whirlwind for a few seconds. It's just a lot of crit chance. Crit chance is incredibly good, especially because you can get so much crit damage on Barbarian. That is incredibly good for us. Then we have Expectant. Expectant is just okay. I think it's snapshot, so it's good to use like 3 lunging strikes before you pop a whirlwind. Not mandatory if you have enough fury, but it's nice for just a little bit of extra damage for us. And then we have the big boys. These are the mandatory legendaries, which are the Ring of Echoing Fury here. The build literally won't function without this because it's just way too expensive fury wise. This gives us 3 but up to 4 fury per second with all of our shout skills. We have 3 shouts, so this is, going to be 9 fury a second. That's really good. And our shouts actually have a pretty low cooldown because we're stacking so much shout stuff. And we also reduce the cooldown not only with one of our glyphs, but also with the legendary Bold Chieftain, where you get a 6-second cooldown reduction if there's just enough enemies around per shout. So if you do all 3 of your shouts in a row while there's a bunch of enemies around, you'll basically get all 3 of your shouts back, which pairs very nicely with the fact that you're getting all this fury generation while all of them are active. So you pretty much just want to slam your keyboard, get all 3 shouts active for the extra fury gen and the cooldown reduction, and that's great. And then lastly, on our amulet, we have Edge Masters for just a bit of extra damage. Feel free to put the stun thing here if you want to, but this is just good extra damage that I think is consistent on the amulet. Then we have the Gore's Unique. This is a fantastic addition to the build. It's not mandatory. The build will still do pretty well without this, but it is a pretty good boost of damage. Just depending on how much damage you actually did while your whirlwind, if this will pop off the second that you end your whirlwind. It can hit for upwards of crazy millions of damage depending on how much you did during the whirlwind cast. So this is a lot of extra damage. You don't lose too much either because you keep ranks to whirlwind. Unfortunately, you lose a little bit of crit chance, but at least you get some lucky hit. Non-physical damage is, I guess, pretty useless, but it's definitely worth the effect that we gain. When it comes to the rest of our legendaries, you want to get the Whirlwind pulls enemies. This counts as a crowd control, and it also just sucks enemies in with your whirlwind, making it just way better to use. But also, when enemies get pulled, they kind of stop any attack they're doing, so it's great for survivability, and it's another great reason to just use whirlwind. Then we have Disobedience, which stacks up very quickly with whirlwind because we are applying bleed and just hitting so many enemies at a time. So that's a crazy amount of armor. And then on the helmet, we have the aspect of Numbing Wrath, which just gives us a whole bunch of extra fortify pretty much all the time because of the way that our Shout of Fury generation works. Again, make sure to check out the website if you want to see all the legendaries and all the priority lists for the stats on gear. But when it comes to the helmets, you want max fury, cooldown reduction, and then total armor and maximum life is your best bet. Strength is also good for extra damage, but the main thing is getting the cooldown reduction for your shouts is incredibly powerful. And then on the chest, you want ranks of Challenging Shout, which gives our Challenging Shout a ridiculous amount of damage reduction. And then you want damage reduction from close, damage reduction while fortified, and then you can either get armor or max HP. That is really good for us. You can just get a crazy amount of damage reduction on the chest, so make sure to look out for that. And then on the gloves, obviously we went for Gores here, but if you just have normal gloves, which is perfectly fine, just go for crit chance, ranks to whirlwind, lucky hit, and strength. Whirlwind does not actually scale off of attack speed, which is funny that these have attack speed on them. At least I'm pretty sure it does not scale off of attack speed. So you don't want attack speed, you mainly just want the ranks to whirlwind and the crit chance, and the other stuff is just supplemental. On the pants, you can get some crazy stuff on pants. I also forgot to mention you want the aspect of might for the extra damage reduction here on the pants. You can also get that on the chest or the helmet. They're all interchangeable, but on the chest, you can get damage reduction while fortified, damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding, and straight up damage reduction, and 42% damage reduction while injured. How can you die while having these pants on? It's a crazy amount of DR. Instead of the damage reduction while injured, you could opt for max HP or even total armor. I'd personally probably go for max HP or the damage reduction while injured, which I think would probably save you quite a lot. When it comes to the boots, these are pretty important. Fury cost reduction and berserking duration are the two most important offensively. Movement speed is fantastic, just increase your clearing speed. And then you also want the damage reduction while injured. then that's pretty much the only thing that you care about on the boots. When it comes to the two-hander here, we have to use a mace, obviously, so we're stuck with overpower damage, which is unfortunate. But for our other stats, we want vulnerable damage, crit damage, strength, and then for the fourth one, you can either go for all stats, which is really good once you're higher level, because you have so much additive damage that the multiplicative damage that you get from the strength that this gives you, and the crit that it gives you actually scales past the additive damage, but that's probably once you're like level 95 plus. I wouldn't worry too much about that. Alternatively, you would want to go for core skill damage or damage to close. Those would be your two best options, and then look at all stats later once you're a much higher level. For your one-handers, you pretty much want the same thing. You want to use two swords because these are going to give you crit damage, while axes give you damage to healthy, and crit damage is much better. And you want to get crit damage, vuln, crit, strength, and then again for the last thing, you want core skill damage or damage to close. Same exact story with your two-hander. We got crit, vuln, strength, core skill. This is literally a perfect two-hander. You want every one of your weapons to basically look like this, or you could swap the core skill to all stats. When it comes to your rings, you want your rings to look pretty similar to this. You want crit chance and vulnerable damage. Those are the two most important things. And then you want crit damage as the third most important. And then if you're lucky enough to get the god roll, the fourth stat you want would be resource generation, because this scales with your legendary, giving you extra fury per second. So the fury generation really just helps out with that. Basically, you'd want this ring here, but instead of the maximum fury, you would want resource generation to replace it. And then when it comes to the amulet, you want to go for +3 ranks to either no mercy or heavy handed. No mercy is great for the additional crit chance here. We get an extra 9% against slowed, and pretty much everything is slowed. Or you could get an extra 15% crit damage while using a two-handed weapon, which is just 15% extra damage, so that's pretty nice. You don't always crit, so it's not crazy. Getting the crit chance is straight up just better in my opinion, but heavy-handed is great as well. Next to that, you want cooldown reduction for your shouts to reduce the cooldown. Then we actually have ranks to defensive skills. A couple of our shouts count as defensive skills, but getting ranks to them just makes them more powerful, does not actually reduce the cooldown, so this is not mandatory. The damage stuff above, like the cooldown reduction and the ranks, is definitely mandatory. And then another thing that would be really, really good for the build would be fury cost reduction, so that our whirlwind just costs way less fury. That on our amulet and our boots just helps the build a ton, especially with the fury management. Outside of that, damage reduction straight up is really good. You can get damage reduction from close, from distance is pretty bad, honestly. Or you could get something like movement speed is really good. When it comes to the gems, on your jewelry, you want to have skulls for the armor. On your weapons, you want emeralds for the crit damage. And on your pieces of gear, because you have unstoppable pretty much all the time, you want to go for sapphires. If you feel like you're dying a lot in crowd control, you can go for the damage reduction while crowd controlled instead of the sapphires. But you have fortify all the time, so the sapphires are quite nice. When it comes to the Paragon board, this will all be on the website, so don't stress too much about it. Just check the website. But basically, in your first board, you want to put territorial. But if you are leveling up, you want to swap territorial with exploit, because you pretty much need the guaranteed vulnerable application via exploit. We have it in the later board here because this board has more dexterity to just get more vulnerable damage. But if you're leveling up and you're not like level 95 yet, you don't have this board at the top unlocked, you definitely put exploit down there first. But we're doing territorial for now. In the next board, we go for the Warbinger board, and then we get Wrath, which is the second most important glyph, and I'd recommend leveling this up ASAP. You get crit damage with core skills, but if you get the additional bonus, any skill that crits generates 3 fury, so this is really amazing for just damage and also fury generation, pretty much a 2-for-1 that is crazy powerful. Get a decent bit of damage on the board, not too much. Our next board is Weapon Master, and this is just for Undaunted. We just slap this in and we get some extra damage to elites and stuff. Undaunted is good for damage while fortified and extra damage reduction. Our next board is Decimator, and then we slap in the Martial Glyph. This is great for cooldown reduction with our shouts, but we also buff some vulnerable damage. I mean, 15% vulnerable damage is nothing to scoff at. Damage reduction from vulnerable enemies is fantastic too. This ultimately just ends up working out pretty nicely for us, and we need that shout skill cooldown reduction to have shouts up pretty much all the time. I'm not sure the name of our next board, but we go in here to get the extra dexterity for exploit. There's not really all that much in here that we care about. There's a little bit of crit damage down here, damage while fortified or whatever, actually. It's pretty good, but we mainly just want the glyph. And then in our last board, we get this is where the crit damage is. We get a bit of crit damage. This is in the Flawless Technique board. Again, the whole thing's on the website, sorry. And then we go for Mortal Draw. This is actually really good because it's damage with skills that swap to new weapons. So as long as we press Lunging Strike right before we press our Whirlwind now has an 18% increased crit chance for the whole duration. And it's also going to do extra damage for the whole duration. So that is just a crazy amount of damage for us, and it really just works out for the build very nicely. Again, the entirety will be on the website. Make sure to check that out, link in the description. But that's going to be it for the build. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please make sure to drop a like, subscribe for videos similar to this one, and I will see you guys later. Peace.